There we go. Okay. So again, I am Tony Marsh. I am the director of the GW Paralegal Studies program. I'm a professor of paralegal studies as well, and I'm also a professor in the GW University in the political science department. I teach constitutional law. So this is a particular interest of mine, and I wanted to share with you some of the interesting aspects of the Electoral College and presidential elections. So I'm going to start by, saying to this is me, Tony Marsh, from George Washington. You know, interestingly, the Constitution, the United States Constitution, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that says all U.S. citizens have the right to vote or you have the right to vote. There's really nothing in there that says that. What is in the Constitution is a provision that says that states can determine the time, place, and manner of voting so that the states, it gives the states the power to determine how voting will take place in their states, which is not quite the same as saying all U.S. citizens have the right to vote. Interesting. So if you look at Article 2, Article 2 is the article that deals with the executive, with the president. And it outlines, the powers of the president, and it says what, all of the executive powers shall be vested in the president, and it talks about the things he can and can't do. He can make treaties. He can appoint judges to the federal courts with the advice and consent of the Senate. So it talks about all of the things that the president can do. Doesn't really say what the president can't do, but again, it's a sort of a negative thing. The Constitution in Article 1 talks about what the courts do, and in Article 1 talks about what the legislature can do, and then Article 3 talks about what the courts can do. And again, there are some specific enumerated powers that each of those branches has. So the legislature can do certain things, the executive, the president can do certain things, and the judicial branch, the judges, can do certain things. In those articles, there's really nothing there that says you can't do this, but the way that we figure out what the various branches can't do is by figuring out what the other two branches can do, and then figuring out whether, for example, the legislature's ability to make law prevents the president from making law. So that's how we figure out what people can't do. That's how the courts figure out what people can't do, is by looking at what other branches can do and then deciding whether that branch's power prevents another branch from exercising the same or similar power. It's interesting, but it's kind of complicated. So that's what we do. So in Article 2 deals with the executive, and it says, again, among other things, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. He, and by the way, we can still say he. We don't have to say he, she, his, her, because as of now, it's been all he's and hims up to this point. I hope that someday we'll get to the point where we'll have to say he or she may use his or her power, but as of now, we're still saying he. So anyway, he shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. And then it says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof, in other words, the state legislature, may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. So, in other words, and we have a map of this a few slides down, so each state gets a number of electors equal to the number of representatives they have, congressmen and congresswomen, plus the number of senators. So Maryland, for example, has 11. We've got 9 representatives and we've got 2 senators. So Maryland gets 11 electors. The minimum number that any state can have is 3, because every state, even if they don't have the necessary number of population to equal one representative, they still get one. So Montana, for example, has got one. Wyoming's got one. Some of these big states with low populations don't even have the minimum number of people to get a representative, but they all get one, plus their two representatives. All right. The only restriction on who can be an elector is that they can't be currently holding an office, an elected office. Okay, so the requirements for being an elector are pretty low, and believe it or not, there have been cases where states have chosen electors who were elected officials and they had to be removed. In practice, states tend to appoint people as electors who are party faithfuls. I mean, the way that you get to be chosen as an elector is you're active in local politics, you become known. Maybe you're a former office holder, maybe you're a former state senator or a former governor or something, or even a former representative. I don't think, but anyway, but you'll be a party faithful, you'll be active in party politics, and you'll be chosen to become an elector. All right. So then it goes on to say the Constitution, back to the issue of the right to vote. Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. So again, the electors choose, so it's up to the states to figure out how they're going to choose the electors, and as we just said, it's usually party faithful. And the electors have to give their vote. They have to cast their votes on a certain day, and it's the same throughout the United States. But until later amendments, there was no uniform day for voting for the citizens to go out and vote for what they think of as voting for president. That came about later in the 1800s. But at any rate, the electors all cast their votes on the same day, which came into play actually during the Bush-Gore election. You may remember, some of you may remember, or some of you who are too young to actually have lived through it, you may have heard or studied that the Bush-Gore election was contested. It came down to a very few number of disputed votes in a couple of Florida counties. So it was completely even. The number of electors, the number of votes was completely even for Bush-Gore. And it all came down to a couple of counties in Florida where those of you, do you remember the hanging chads? So there were paper ballots in Florida that had a little piece of cardboard, they were cardboard, and they had a little piece of cardboard that you would punch out with a stylus. You would go in to the voting booth, you would actually insert your card, they would give you a stylus, and you were supposed to punch out that little, it was called a chad, which we all learned in 2000. You were supposed to punch out the chad next to the person that you wanted to vote for. Some of those chads weren't entirely punched out. There were dimpled chads, and there were hanging chads, and there was a lot of dispute over whether, there were four corners to the chad, whether one detached corner was enough to count, or two, or three, or four, whatever, to count as a vote. And during that whole recount process, they were bumping up against the deadline for the electors to cast their votes. And the Supreme Court came in, and that's where the Supreme Court, people say they actually ended up choosing the president, because the Supreme Court came in and by a narrow majority said there's not enough time to go in and count all those ballots by hand, all those chads, by the deadline by which the electors have to cast their vote. There's just not enough time to get that all done. There was like 2 days left. They said you can't possibly do it in 2 days, so they ended the recount. That was the deadline that they were bumping up against. It was the deadline by which the electors had to go in and cast their vote. It was in January. And so that's how that all came down. And then, of course, Bush and the Secretary of State of Florida and the governor of Florida, who happened to be George Bush's brother, declared Florida for Bush, and that was the end of that. So Bush won the election. Okay, so now, as I said, so the electors meet in there. This is more about the process for the electors. So here's what they're required to do. They meet in their respective states, and they vote for the president and vice president, all of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. So in other words, the only restriction on the electors is that at least they each cast 2 votes. One needs to be for someone who is not from their own home state. That's the only restriction. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the electors must cast their ballots for the person who won the popular vote in their state. There is nothing in the Constitution about that. Now, I've edited this down for length, but you can go read it yourself, and you will see that in the 12th Amendment and in the Article 1 and in all of the talk about the Electoral College, there's nothing that says the electors must cast their votes for the person who won the popular vote in their state. So what happens is you go to the polls. Americans all over the country go to the polls. We do exercise our right to vote, even though the Constitution doesn't specifically give us that right. We have had that right. We cast our vote for president and vice president. So those of you who remember from the last election, you saw there was Donald J. Trump and Michael, whatever his middle initial is, Pence. And then there was Hillary R. Clinton and Timothy something Kane. And there were a few others. There's always like 6 or 7 choices on the ballot for president and vice president. But you probably voted, right, for someone. You cast your vote, and you thought you were voting for president, but you weren't. You were not voting for president. You were voting for the person. What you were essentially doing was you were choosing who was going to be the winner in your state, and then the assumption is that the slate of electors for your state was then going to go on January, whatever it was, 18th or whatever it was. I don't know. I don't remember the exact date, or December, that the electors go in, and they were going to go in on that day. I think it's December because the inauguration's in January. Anyway, they were going to go in on that day, and they are going to cast their ballots for whoever won the popular vote in your state. That's what you thought was going to happen, right? That's what has happened in elections throughout American history. So you go in, you cast your vote. That's why the news, when they are announcing the elections, they don't say, so far in the United States, there are 3 million votes for Donald Trump and 3.4 million votes for Hillary Clinton. Instead, they say California's going for Clinton, Pennsylvania's going for Trump, Alabama's going for Trump. That's why they call it state by state, because that's how the votes are counted and that's how they're cast. So a state, so let's say, for example, Pennsylvania, I think Pennsylvania went for Trump. So Pennsylvania goes for Trump. Now what happens is the slate of electors that has been chosen to cast their votes on Pennsylvania's behalf then meets on that one day, and I think it's December, and casts all of their votes for Trump. That's how it's always been. But as you can see, there's nothing in the Constitution that requires them to do that. And a little bit of a sidebar here. Here's one more. Here's the only other restriction on the Electoral College. No person shall be an elector, a member of the Electoral College, if they have engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against the United States. That's a Civil War. That's a Civil War thing. All right. And by the way, or post-Civil War. By the way, the Congress can actually remove that disability. This is what I was getting to. On the topic of us having the right to vote, as I said, there's nothing in the Constitution that says all U.S. citizens have the right to vote. But what it does say is you can't be denied your right to vote. We sort of get this negative right through the Constitution. So you can't be denied your right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You can't be denied your right to vote on the basis of being under the age of 18. And you can't be denied, the right to vote, on the basis of sex. I guess I didn't put that one in there, but that one's in there as well. So you can't be denied the right to vote on the basis of race, on the basis of sex, or or if you're over the age of 18. So in other words, they give you the age, they give the right to vote to people over the age of 18. Okay, so back to the Electoral College. Here are the numbers that that various states get, the number of electors that you get. So here, up in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, they get 3 because they each have 1 representative. California's got 55. Illinois's got 20. Pennsylvania's got 20. Ohio's got 18. Florida 29. So, Texas 38. You can see where these big states carry a lot of weight, right? So you can see why winning California is a huge boost to anyone, any one of the presidential candidates. Winning Texas, winning Florida. These are huge boosts for the candidates. And that's of course because all of the population is wrapped up in those states. But you can also see, and I am no math whiz, so I'm not even going to try to do the numbers for you, but this is how a person can win the popular vote and still lose the election. So let's just say, for example, Texas. So Texas has got 38 electoral votes. Let's say that there's 20 million people that live in Texas. That's not how many there are, but let's just say. Let's say that 20,000,001 vote for one candidate and 19,999,999 vote for the other candidate. All 38 are going to go to that one candidate who won just by 1 vote. Same thing in California. Say there's 50 million people in California and, 25,000,001 vote for one person. All those 55 electoral votes are going to go for that person. That means that in the state of California, those 24,999,999 votes are essentially thrown away. They count for nothing. They count for 0, right? All 55 votes are going to go to that person who won by 1 vote. And all 25 million votes minus 1 are going to essentially be thrown away. That's how you can win the popular vote, as Hillary Clinton did, and lose the election. Or as Al Gore did. Al Gore also won the popular vote. He had more votes than George Bush overall, but lost the election. It's why many people are, trying to remove the Electoral College, because essentially your vote could get thrown away if you live in a state that goes the other way. So here's what happened. So here's a real picture of a group of electors in the state of Washington filling out their ballots in 2016. This is the Trump-Clinton race, right? So they're gathered there to cast their votes. Now, what happened was the state of Washington went for Hillary Clinton. Now, I don't know if you remember this, and let's go back and see how many votes Washington has. Washington's got 12 votes, right? So right after November 9th, right after Election Day, when they called the election for Donald Trump, there was a lot of unrest. There was a lot of angst around the country. Many people, more than usual. The people who lose an election are always sad and angry and, sort of accusatory. But in this case, there was more. There was more angst about it. And there was talk about the electors going rogue and about them not casting their votes for Donald Trump, or for, in other ways, trying to disrupt the result. And so a group of electors around the country actually made an agreement, and they said that they would not cast their votes for either Trump or Clinton. What they were trying to do was they were going to cast their votes for a third person, and what it would do it would deprive any of the candidates of a majority. Now, it was a little bit of a goofy, I think, not even legally, but the idea that Clinton voters would not cast their vote for Clinton again, I'm no math whiz. I don't see how the numbers work, but this was their plan, was that they were going to go rogue. That's what they call it. They were going to go rogue. They were going to be faithless electors. They were not going to cast their vote for the person who won the election. And so a group of electors in Washington state did not cast their vote for Clinton. Instead, they cast their votes for Colin Powell for president. The Washington Secretary of State fined each of those electors $1,000. The electors appealed to an administrative law judge who upheld the fine. Then they went to trial. They filed suit in a trial court. The trial court upheld the fine. Then they went to the Washington State Supreme Court. The Washington State Supreme Court upheld the fine. That's where it stands right now. So the case is called In Re Guerra, and you can find it, these numbers afterwards. I know I see a couple of my students are in this, are watching, so you know this. That's the citation. That's where you can find this case. So if you wanted to read this case for yourself, you go to 193 Washington Reporters 2nd, page 380, or you go to 441 Pacific Reporter 3rd edition, page 807. But this is a 2019 Washington Supreme Court case, and the court essentially upholds the fine. The electors argued a couple of things. They argued that in being fined, they were being deprived of their right to freedom of speech, to express themselves as they wished. And so the court did not buy that argument. They upheld the fine against these electors. So this is a state Supreme Court, right? The Washington State Supreme Court. And the Washington State Supreme Court writes, nothing under Article 2, Section 1, or the 12th Amendment to the Constitution grants to the electors absolute discretion in casting their votes. An elector acts under the authority of the state, and no First Amendment right is violated when a state imposes a fine based on an elector's violation of his pledge. So in other words, the Washington State Supreme Court takes, again, a negative, instead of saying you're not prohibited from casting your vote as you wish, they're saying nothing allows you to cast your vote as you wish. So there's two ways of saying this, right? Like any of you who have kids, your kid might say, and you've all heard, well, you didn't tell me I had to be, that you didn't tell me I wasn't allowed to smoke cigarettes. Well, I also didn't tell you you were allowed. So there's two different ways of looking at it. Some people say you can't do what's prohibited. Others say you can't do what's not authorized, right? Like, or you'll say to your kid, I did not give you permission to take the family car. And that's a better example. And your kid will say, well, you didn't say I couldn't, right? So those are the two ways of looking at the argument. So the electors said there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits us from casting our vote, and in fact, we have the right to express ourselves under the First Amendment, and this is how we're expressing ourselves. Washington State Supreme Court says nothing in the Constitution allows you to do that either, right? So they say it's not. So they uphold the fine and essentially say an elector has got to cast his vote as the state directs him to, or her. So in the case of In Re Guerra, then, a group of lawyers now took on this case and filed a petition for writ of certiorari in the United States Supreme Court. They've asked the United States Supreme Court to look at it. And they said to the United States Supreme Court, if you will decide this case now, and this is from the petition and a petition for writ of certiorari, by the way, is what you file when you ask the Supreme Court to hear your case. The Supreme Court is not obligated to hear any cases. You don't have a right to appeal to the Supreme Court in any case. Well, there's a couple of cases for which the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, but they're very narrow, and it's not this. So in order to get your case in front of the Supreme Court, you've got to file what's called a petition for writ of certiorari. You've got to ask the Supreme Court to hear your case, and you've got to convince them that it's a good idea for them to take this case, that there's a good reason for them to take the case. And so one of the things you'll say is that there's really major constitutional issues, which clearly in this case there are. And then you're also going to give them some other incentives or try to convince them that is a good idea. So one of the things that they write in this case is, in their petition for writ of certiorari, they tell the court, this case permits the court to issue a decision outside of the white-hot scrutiny of a contested presidential election. And by the way, here's a photo of them looking at those ballots and looking at those hanging chads in the Florida election, which turned out to be so controversial and so divisive. I mean, a lot of ill will was engendered. But people still look at that and say the Supreme Court cast their vote for George Bush, which the Supreme Court is not supposed to do. I mean, there's a lot of people that are still very bitter about that happening. So what these guys are saying to the Supreme Court is, look, decide this case now. Don't wait until the next election when you get a bunch of rogue electors doing this again, and then you're going to have to decide it, and you're going to end up throwing the election to one or the other candidates, and that's going to be a disaster. Better you decide this now in advance so that you look unbiased. That there's no question that you're throwing the election to one candidate or the other. And I think it's a good argument. Okay, now but then what happens is there's another case. Now there's another case. This is in Colorado. Same thing, same election, 2016. Electors in Colorado, 3 electors in Colorado decide they're going to cast their vote for John Kasich, who was the governor of Ohio, who was also running as a Republican. Same reason, again, they were going to cast their votes for another person to try to deprive Trump of a majority so he can't take office. So these 3 people decide that they're going to these 3 electors decide that they're going to cast their vote for John Kasich. The first guy does it, Baca. He casts his vote for Kasich. When the Colorado Secretary of State sees him do this, the Secretary of State literally stops Baca, takes his vote, throws it away, discards it, and kicks Baca off the slate of electors. So the other 2 electors see what happens, and they say, well, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're going to just go ahead and cast our votes the way we're supposed to. After the election, all 3 electors sued the Colorado Department of State. The Colorado Department of State, the government, the state government, moves to dismiss on 2 grounds. They say failure to state a claim upon which relief can be granted and standing to sue. So in other words, they're saying, first of all, the other 2 who didn't change their vote, who got scared and ended up voting the right way, have no standing to sue. They weren't harmed. And the court agrees with that, and they say, you're right, you weren't harmed. They throw those 2 out. But then they also say you don't have a claim, that you have not been, and even Baca, they're saying, in other words, you have not been wronged. You have no right to sue. You have not been wronged. So they dismiss. So Baca appeals to the 10th Circuit, which is a federal court, not a state court. It's a federal court. So we have 2 court systems that run in the United States. Each state has its own court system. So if you live in North Dakota, you've got the North Dakota State Court. You live in Washington, right? You go through the Washington courts. You've got all the way, every state's got a trial court, an appellate court, and a court of last resort. So their own private state Supreme Court. But then we've also got a federal court system, and that federal court system is in charge of the whole United States. And what they do is they break up the states into circuits, and each circuit will encompass a couple of states. So the circuits are bigger than states. So the 10th Circuit takes in a couple of states, including Colorado. But these are federal courts, and federal courts are above state courts. One of the clauses in the United States Constitution is the Supremacy Clause. And what that says is anytime you've got state and federal bodies, laws, anything bumping up against each other, federal wins. Not anytime, there's exceptions to everything in the law, but most of the time. So the Supremacy Clause says that federal anything is over state anything just about. And so the 10th Circuit, which is a federal court, they hold that the removal of Baca and the nullification of his vote were unconstitutional. So the 10th, and this is, by the way, is actually literally you see Baca on there. This is literally the slate, the vote. that they filed. So the 10th Circuit writes, electors once appointed are free to vote as they choose. While the Constitution grants the states plenary power to appoint their electors, it does not provide the states the power to interfere once voting begins, to remove an elector, to direct the other electors to disregard the removed elector's vote, or to appoint a new elector to cast a replacement vote. So that's what the United States Court of Appeals is saying. They have ruled electors can vote as they want. So you've got a state Supreme Court saying electors have to follow, they have to vote, they have to cast their vote for whoever wins the popular vote in their state. You've got a federal court of appeals saying electors can cast their vote any way they want. And by the way, so you've got trial court, appellate court, Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court is the highest court, it's the court of last resort. So in Washington State, you've got the state's highest court saying that the electors have to cast their vote in the way that they pledge to do so. You've got a appellate court, not a court of last resort, in the 10th Circuit saying they don't have to do this. So you've got some you know, you've got federal over state, but you've got Supreme over appeals. So you've got what we have now is an unanswered question. We have an unresolved issue. As it stands right now, it is unsettled law as to whether an elector must cast his or her vote for the person who won the popular vote in their state. It's unsettled law. So until that, and that's where we stand right now. What's the final answer? I don't know. I don't know the final answer. This is the petition for writ of certiorari that was filed in the United States Supreme Court in October of 2019. It was just filed, or I think this was filed actually in May. No, I'm sorry, October of 2019. So this is the petition for writ of certiorari in the Guerra case. So this is the Washington case. They've appealed, and this is the question presented. So this is what they've asked the Supreme Court to decide. A Washington state law threatens a fine for presidential electors who vote contrary to how the law directs. Petitioners are 3 presidential electors who are fined under this provision solely because they failed to vote as the law directs, namely for the president and vice president who won a majority of the popular vote in the state. The question presented is whether enforcement of this law is unconstitutional because 1, a state has no power to legally enforce how a presidential elector casts his or her ballot, and 2, a state penalizing an elector for exercising his or her constitutional discretion to vote violates the First Amendment. So those are the questions. We don't have an answer yet. The Supreme Court has not yet said whether they'll accept this case at all, and certainly we don't know how the Supreme Court's going to rule, and that's where I'm going to leave it. Like I said, I'm going to leave it as it's a cliffhanger. So will we, as it is right now, when you go to vote for president, you really have no assurance that, number 1, your vote's going to count at all, and number 2, that whatever state you live in, that those electors are going to even vote for that person. I mean, they could cast their votes for, me if they want. They wouldn't, but they could, right? So I will leave you with that. And that's why I said in the description of this session, it's illuminating and a little bit terrifying. Because until this question gets settled, we have no idea what's going to happen. As though this country weren't under enough uncertainty and stress, we have no idea how the 2020 election is going to go. So let's all hope that the Supreme Court takes this case and settles this issue once and for all. And certainly, if and when they do, we will hold a follow-up webinar on this topic. I would love to come back and revisit this issue. So I'll leave it at that. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just jump right in. You can unmute yourself. You just put your cursor on your screen and you'll see a little red microphone and you hit that.
I just want to say I'm one of those Floridians who knows how to mess up an election.
Well, get out there and vote. Make sure that that Chad is not dimpled or hanging. we don't even use paper votes anymore, which is a whole other issue, but we won't go there. But thank you for doing your part, April, to
Of course.
keep this election clear.
I have to say we do have a paper trail in Maryland, even though we still file, I think we still have computers.
I think we get a receipt, don't we, in Maryland?
Yeah.
Which is great. I mean, there's a lot of people, election security specialists, who say you definitely want a paper trail. That's you want to have some sort of paper receipt.
Thank you. This was very informative.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. All right, then. So thank you all so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to be here with you today. We will send the recording of this to you along with the slides. And yes, and keep an eye on our webpage. Keep an eye out for this, because we will absolutely conduct a follow-up webinar when the Supreme Court takes this on. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.